evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are starting this evening's program. Shall we please be on our feet as the speaker and the chair take the high table? I humbly ask that we put our mobile phones also on silent. Thank you. President of the Academy, past presidents of the Academy, vice presidents of the Academy, fellows of the Academy, honorable and distinguished guests, your excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the president and fellows of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, we welcome you all warmly to this event, which is the annual lecture in the Humanities for the 2025. My name is Professor J, Honorary Secretary of the Academy. And by way of introduction, as many of us are aware, the Academy's annual lectures in the Humanities and in the Sciences were instituted about 30 years ago, in the year 1993, as a platform for fellows and non-fellows of the Academy to share their thoughts with the Ghanaian populace on topical national issues. And on this evening, we are privileged to have Professor KOFI OPOKU NTI, a fellow of the Academy, and also the immediate past president of the Academy, to deliver this year's annual lecture in the Humanities. Of note, we mentioned that the program is being streamed live on Facebook and also on the Academy's YouTube page. On this note, we take this opportunity to also warmly welcome those of us joining us online. At this juncture, my duty is to introduce the chairperson for this event, who will then steer the program. I will provide a brief bio sketch. The chairperson for this program is an emerita professor at the University of Ghana, Legon. She served as director of the Social Development Policy Division of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and director of the Institute of African Affairs, University of Ghana, from 2002 to 2009. In 2022, she was appointed senior fellow at the Ghana Center for Democratic Development, and a year later, as honorary professor at Nelson Mandela University, South Africa. Our chair holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in law from the University of Ghana, Legon, and the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and a PhD in anthropology from Indiana University in the USA. She has published widely and has researched on African development, human rights, women's rights and empowerment, contemporary African migrations, and African higher education systems. Our chair is a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences and presently vice president of the arts section of the academy. She has received several awards and recognitions, including the University of Ghana's Meritorious Service Award in the year 2007, Ghana's Order of the Volta Officer Class 2008, honorary doctorate degrees from the University of Sussex, UK, and the Franco-German Prize for Human Rights and the Rule of Law in the year 2023. With these few words, let's welcome Emerita Professor TAKYIWAA MANUH. Thank you.
Good evening. I was waiting for him to perform the trick so I will appear taller than I am, and he has done it duly. President of the Academy, past presidents of the Academy, Vice President Arts, Fellows of the Academy present and those joining us virtually, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and our dear students. I'm also pleased to welcome all of you to the Academy as you join us this evening for the annual lecture in the Humanities, which is being delivered this year by Professor KOFI OPOKU NTI, and I would like to introduce him briefly. He's been very modest, so when you look at the brochure, you find that they've tried to make me taller, even though we are about the same height. So I'm trying to ensure that we keep the truth, the equality. So Professor KOFI OPOKU NTI, as you have been told, is immediate past president of the Academy. He was educated at Yale University in the USA, where he obtained a BA degree in physics and then a PhD in operational research and economics. So especially to our students, don't think that because you have done this, you can't do something else. So this man has a BA degree in physics, but he's better known as an economist. And in economics, his PhD is in operational research and economics, and he specializes in game theory. I'm not talking about the games that you play, game theory. So you can go and look it up, game theory. He has been employed in several places in the US before coming to Ghana. He was employed at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, Georgia, Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, Penn State University in Pennsylvania, before coming to the University of Ghana Business School, where he served as the dean and later as the first occupant of the Unilever Professorial Chair in Business at the University of Ghana, Legon. Professor KOFI OPOKU NTI is a member of several academic and learned societies, including the Public Choice Society, the Institute for Operations, Research and Management Sciences, and the European Association of Industrial Economists. But unlike many of us, Professor KOFI NTI has not just stayed in academia, but has tried to operationalize, since he does operations research, he has tried to operationalize the theory. So he's very involved in business in the private sector. And currently, he's the director of the Universal Hospitals Group. He's chair of Claim Limited. What does Claim Limited do? Yeah, so they are insurance brokers. So he's chairman of Claim Limited and chairman and managing director of Lemon Foods Limited. So he's gotten his hands dirty. And so when he decides to speak to us on the topic of prospects and pathways for economic transformation in Ghana, he's doing it both as a citizen, as a Ghanaian, as an economist, but also as somebody who has tried the market and knows the perils of it all. So this is a topic that should interest all of us because we have been waiting for this economic transformation for many, many years. And for some of us, as we grow older, we are beginning to despair about whether we will see this economic transformation. So this evening, Professor KOFI OPOKU NTI is going to bring us closer to let us understand, and perhaps in the end, to go away feeling pessimistic or optimistic that this economic transformation is taking place. It's taking place. So as I wait for the young ladies to settle in their seats, the rest of us will be leaving Professor KOFI NTI because he has taken on a very big topic. So we will come and join the front row as we listen eagerly to him speak to us on the topic of prospects and pathways for economic transformation in Ghana. So, Professor, this is your audience. Thank you very much.
Good evening. President of the Academy, past presidents, Vice President, Arts and Sciences, Fellows of the Academy, students, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you also. Today my topic is on prospects and pathways for economic transformation in Ghana. It's a big topic, and I will try and do justice to it and hopefully motivate many of you to become active participants in this journey for transformation. I would like to start by acknowledging our sponsors, Universal Hospitals Group, Associated Consultants, and Claim Limited. I also wish to acknowledge those who are watching online, friends and family, and special guests. I thank all of you for coming and spending your time to join us this evening. Let me start with an outline of what we are going to be talking about today. We have introduction, GDP and international trade developments, nature of economic transformation, how Asia worked, and GOG, the Government of Ghana's Economic Transformation Agenda, opportunities and pathways, and finally some recommendations. Let me start with the introduction. 4 recent events and announcements make the topic we are going to discuss today very important for all of us, and especially for the youth and the next generation of leaders. 1, Ghana Statistical Service report that over 13 million Ghanaians are food insecure, and the food insecurity rate has risen by over 7% between the first quarter of 2024 and the fourth quarter of 2024. At the World Bank meeting, they raised concern. Second thing, at the World Bank Minister of Finance meeting, they raised concerns that Ghana's per capita income has stagnated around $2,200 for a decade, and poverty levels have risen to over 25% of the population. They also said that Ghana could be an upper middle income country if in the next generation if we put our economic house in order. Today, as we speak, farmers are threatening to boycott the 2025 Farmers' Day celebrations because of the government's failure to address ongoing challenges facing rice, maize, and soybean producers. The farmers say that over 200,000 metric tons of local rice from the 2024 harvest remain unsold, while another 1.5 million metric tons, is expected from the ongoing 2025 harvest. And there is also over 100,000 metric tons of maize from the 2024 harvest season still unsold. The farmers and the millers are putting pressure on the National Buffer Stock Company to purchase the unsold stock, and there are reports that Cabinet has approved the release of funds to NAFCO to do that. Ghana's population is over 35 million. It ranks 46 out of 233 countries and dependencies. The population of Ghana is projected to be 50 million in 2025. That is in 25 years from now. Half of the current population is less than 21 years. What kind of future and economic vision do we have for the oncoming stream of young and middle-aged people that will inhabit the land in the next 25 years? Let's see this slide. This slide gives the median age of different countries throughout the world. And Africa has the youngest population. GDP and international trade. As I mentioned earlier, there's been stagnant or slow growth in the GDP per capita. The informal sector size is big and it raises interesting taxation issues. Historically, GDP growth rates are insufficient. What we have is insufficient to support economic transformation. Then we shall discuss the sectoral composition of GDP, how it has shifted from agriculture and industry to low-value services. And finally, I'll look at the shifts and growth in the subsectors. So let's look at the first one. This is economic aggregates, and it tells us that basically our GDP has stagnated around 2,200, And it fluctuates from about 1,700 in 2015 to about 2,570 in 2023. In cedi terms, GDP per capita was about 4,710 cedis in 2013 and currently 35,000 in 2024. But high inflation and the cedi depreciation eroded much of the value. Using what they call purchasing power parity, Ghana's GDP is about $7,500 and Ghana ranks 128 among 181 countries. The informal sector contributes about 25% of Ghana's GDP, out of the provisional GDP of 1.176 billion, 43 billion. The informal sector accounted for 21.7%. Now, Ghana has been struggling to figure out how to tax the informal sector. The past government argued that taxing mobile money transfers was the key to solving that problem. Because they've seen this big number, and they say, how can we get our hands on some of that? However, the e-levy was a double taxation for those who were transferring already taxed money, let's say salaries, or earnings to friends, families, and business associates. And there are no effective way of excluding those who should be exempt from taxes or equitably treat similarly situated taxpayers. You should not base tax policy on aggregate data, but rather you should unpack the data to determine how many are above the income threshold and figure out a way to tax them equitably. So the fact that we saw the big number got the finance people to think they must have a way of getting at it. And they used a broad stroke to tax it. Very unpopular, and eventually they gave it up. Ghana's GDP growth rate has ranged from about 0.5% to 8.1% during the period we are under discussion, that's 2013 to 2024. The maximum growth rate occurred in 2017 due to an expansion of the oil and gas sector, and the minimum of 0.5 occurred in 2020, a COVID-19 shock. Ghana's GDP averaged about 4.3% over the period. However, if we exclude the COVID years, the average growth rate was about 4.6, still very small. So let's look at that. So I have here what different countries, especially Asian countries, experienced over their highest 10-year growth periods. And you can see that Ghana's best was 7.8% over a 10-year period, 2004 to 2013. South Korea had 11.29 over those years, and China 10.69, and so on. So the kind of numbers we need, about 10% to transform Ghana, will take some work to do that. So that is our experience based on our past performance, 7.8%. Then we can look at the composition of GDP. Let me get some water. Look at the composition of GDP, and we divide the GDP into three major classes: agriculture, industry, and services. And you can see from these numbers that practically agriculture is about 20-something%, industry is about 30% or thereabouts, and services is about 47%. And it looks like industry has been declining, agriculture declined, and then it picked up a little bit, and services really just keeps increasing. Then let's look at the individual components of the agriculture, industry, and services. So let's look at agriculture. We break it down into crops. Cocoa is special within the crop because of its value within the foreign trade. Then we have livestock, forestry and logging, fishing, agriculture, and fishing. Then we have a sum total for all of that. And you can see that crops has been the strongest so far. It's been the largest sector. Cocoa has been declining in terms of its share. And livestock has gone down, similarly forestry, fishing, and so on. So we have some challenges in agriculture that it's not been picking up as well. Then we look at the industry, and there we divide it into mining and quarrying. And within that mining and quarrying sector, we have oil and gold. Then we have manufacturing, and then electricity, water and sewerage, construction, and then we sum up everything. Again, you can see that mining and quarrying has been pretty stable, about 13%. But within the sector, gold has really taken up a big chunk of the GDP, 8%. And then oil has given way. It's gone to about 4.4%. There are stories going on that currently the new fields are not being opened up, and so we are losing our capacity to keep the numbers up. But then manufacturing. Again, manufacturing has also been on the decline. It's about 10% now. And construction was very big, but increasingly it has lost its percentage. Let me mention that a share can decline in a subsector, even if the subsector has increased absolutely. Because by the share, we are looking at how fast you are growing relative to the other sectors. So even though you might get bigger, if your rate of growth is less than the average, then others will occupy the space, right? So it doesn't mean that because the growth has gone down, it's not expanding, but it's not expanding at a fast enough rate. Then we look at the services, and there I've left out many of them because there are lots of them, but I want to just keep your attention on just a few here. And you'll notice that of the 47%, almost half is in what they call wholesale and retail trade and repair of vehicles and household goods. If you drive through Accra, you see a lot of repair shops, right? You know, fixing cars, doing all sorts of things. You see a lot of traders, and that is a very big sector. In fact, it's bigger than agriculture. Whereas if we look at the agriculture number, just the wholesale and trade sector is bigger than that. Then we look at accommodation and services, storage and communication, transport, you know, the trotros, you see the other things, right, services. And then we have communication, information communication. And you see that it has been growing quite well. And it actually saved our lives during the COVID time because everybody was indoors and we needed to communicate and we had to use the information services. The government has managed to keep its share pretty constant. It means government is getting bigger and bigger. It's keeping the same share of a bigger economy. Finance and insurance, there was a time when finance was very big and there were a lot of banks and then many collapsed. And so you see the percentage has also gone down. I also looked at the growth rate over all the sectors, to see the subsectors, to see which has been the most growing. And interestingly, you see that information and communication has been the fastest growing over the 10-year period. Oil, 9.7, gold, 8.8. And then health and social services, social work and livestock. And down at the bottom, you see that fishing, forestry and logging and cocoa have all had negative growth within that period, negative average growth within the period. So gold stands out, and gold has its own issues about galamsey and the threat to our environment and our survival. So we'll come to that later. So what I have here is a picture showing you internet costs globally in 2025. Remember, we said that communication was the growing sector in Ghana. It turns out that Ghana ranks as one of the highest internet charges of $2.58 per megabit per second for fixed broadband, right? $2.58. Nigeria is $0.72. The charges in Ghana are 3.6 times higher than what Nigerians pay. I think we should encourage the Minister of Communication to do something about that, because we are paying a lot for something that is very critical to our interactions, our businesses, and everything. So now let me get to compare our performance against some of the Asian countries. So here we look at the sector composition, and I give you their population, the GDP per capita, and I give you their percentages in the various sectors. That is agriculture, industry, manufacturing, and services. And you will notice that all of them have much higher manufacturing sector than we do. In fact, Indonesia is like the odd country out. But if you look at China, South Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, they're all above 20%. Ghana is 11% in manufacturing. Look at agriculture, you see that they are all very low, 1.1, 1.6% in Korea, 7.8, 8.6, 11. Indonesia, China, 6.9, and we are 20.9. But yet they produce more, and they supply us most of the rice we eat, and other things, oil, cooking oil, and lots of stuff, right? So in agriculture contributes a much smaller share of GDP in the Asian countries, yet they are major producers and exporters of agricultural products. Industry contributes a bigger share in Asia. Manufacturing represents a bigger share of the industrial sector. Ghana's manufacturing sector is small in two ways. First, it is small relative to the whole economy, and secondly, it constitutes a smaller portion of the industrial sector. So our key issues will revolve around agriculture and manufacturing. Let's look at international. I'll skip this one. It just tells us about which countries are considered middle income, upper income, low income, and so on, right? And currently, Ghana is in the lower middle income category. And many of the Asian countries are in the upper middle income categories. And Vietnam is in the lower middle income category, like us, but it is accelerating very fast. So by the time we hear about it again, it probably be a upper middle income country. In 2024, the Ghana Statistical Service provided a latest summary of Ghana's international trade profile. The total value of exports was about $20.6 billion US dollars, and imports was about $7.5 billion US dollars. Ghana has a trade surplus, one of the rare moments of $3.1 billion US dollars. And we trade with more than 200 countries. We export to 150 countries and import from more than 200 countries. We exported over 2,500 products and imported over 4,000 products. But three products accounted for over 80% of our exports. Gold was 55.3%. Mineral fuel and oil was 18.4%. And cocoa beans took up 9.7%. On the import side, we are minerals and fuel oil is 25.7, machinery was 13.1, and chemicals was about 9.6. We have some gaps in chemicals. So the chemistry people, as my brother here would say, will have to up their game. Our top destinations were United Arab Emirates, right? Switzerland, South Africa, China, and India. And they accounted for 67% of our exports. Our import sources were China, United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, India, and the United States. And they account for about 50% of our imports. So let's look now at the comparison with Asia. A key feature of Ghana's international trade profile is that the country is well integrated into international trade. Ghana's international trade ranks in the top 100 in trade intensity or openness. It is more open than China and Indonesia, but not close to Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. It should be noted that Ghana international trade is heavily concentrated on a few products and trading partners. Ghana is therefore vulnerable to swings in the prices of the major commodities and exports of gold, oil, and cocoa, as well as policy changes in the trading partners, in the countries that they trade with. Recently, President Trump said he was going to impose tariffs on many countries and to affect how accessible certain countries will be for us. So let's look at the export shares. And again, you see that the percentages of exports in the major Asian countries are very high. They export a lot of stuff. 48%, 73%, 65%. Vietnam is like 93%. Right? You're going to hear about Vietnam a lot because they are doing a lot of stuff. And when you look at imports, the same people are importing a lot of stuff, processing it, and shipping it out. Right? Ghana's imports are about 25%, and the exports are about 27%. China is also one of those places. It imports, it ships a lot of stuff out. And South Korea is similar. So they are all very heavy into international trade. Let's now look at some interesting feature about Ghana's international trade. We can group our exports in terms of whether we are exporting capital goods, consumer goods, intermediate goods, or raw materials. And you can see from these numbers that we don't export much, minuscule in capital goods. But the comparators, apart from Indonesia, which is in the shaky grounds, are doing like 40% and over. In capital goods, the goods that you use to make things. And then in consumer goods, we don't export much. And China, the Asian countries, are pushing a lot of consumer goods. And we see them in the markets all the time. Intermediate goods, the things you use to further make final goods. And also oil, they put in intermediate goods. Again, you see that we are importing a lot of it. And when it comes to raw materials, we are exporting a lot of raw materials, and the Asian countries are exporting fewer raw materials, 4%, single digits, and we are like almost 50%. So there's a big difference in the structure. And then what I've done is to aggregate these two numbers. Look at capital goods and consumer goods. And you see that total, Ghana is 8.2 of GDP. And when you look at intermediate goods and raw materials, we are exporting almost 92%. So the gap is very sharp. You look at this number and say, wow. IG and RM, Asians are doing some 20%. Indonesia, I say, is an outlier. And we are doing 90%. When you look at capital goods and consumer goods, we are exporting 8.2%. The others are doing 70%. So a lot of the stuff we are getting are coming from those places. Let's look at imports. Again, we look at whether the imports, the things coming in, are capital goods, consumer goods, intermediate goods, or raw materials. And again, we see that consumer goods are keen in Ghana, 50%. The others are doing 20-something%. Raw material, we don't import a lot of raw materials. You import raw materials if you are processing them. Right? So you see that the countries processing raw materials are double digits, and we are at single digits. And then capital goods, we import some of it, but it's not as heavy as those who are doing manufacturing and other things. So again, I group them into consumer goods and then the rest of the goods. And consumer goods, we are keen again, and so lots of the final goods we are consuming are all imported compared to the Asian countries. So I think our work is cut out for us. That's what we need to do if we wish to emulate the high-growth Asian countries, to become an upper middle-income country. We need sustained economic growth. We need to induce what they call structural change in the production. We must tilt towards manufacturing, and we should make agriculture more productive, and also get into more high-value services as opposed to the repairs and maintenance of household goods and others, and retail and wholesaling. We also have to restructure our international trade to promote importation of capital, raw materials, and intermediate goods to facilitate the processing of consumer goods for local consumption and for export. So our work is cut out for us. We know what we should be doing. Let me give you an aside. One time I went to the grocery and I saw a pack of black-eyed beans. And I took a look at it. It was packaged in Ghana, but the product came from India. So some Indians, an Indian company, imports the black-eyed beans and packages it in Ghana and sells to Ghana. Right? The same way that Indians and Vietnamese are importing cashew from Ghana to package in their countries for consumption and export. So we should think the same way. We can bring raw materials from anywhere, package it, consume it, or export it. We just have to know how to do those things. And if an Indian can come and set it up in Ghana and bring raw materials from his country or her country to do that, it should be feasible for Ghanaians to do the same thing. The same thinking should apply when we look at fabrication, where we can bring raw materials like aluminum, plastics, paper, and steel to make various products for local use and for export into the sub-region. Let me stress that Ghana cannot or should not do the same thing that the Asian countries are doing, or they did. It should draw lessons from the Asian experience and craft its own strategies, building on its endowment capacities and values, what I call the guiding principles that shape our behavior and our ethos, the characteristic spirit of a culture as manifested in its attitudes and aspirations. I think for now, I can define for you what we mean by economic transformation. I've kept that for a little while. And I look at an ODI briefing paper, and it said, why economic transformation? And it said, and I put the directed in quote because they did not put that in. They said, a process for moving labor and resources from lower to higher productivity activities. And I inserted directed because it doesn't happen autonomously. Some people will have to push it to happen. If you left it to its own, it might stay the same way that it is. So you need some guidance or some direction or some external push to get some of those things to happen. So they give examples. Like, for example, I can move resources between the sectors, from agriculture to manufacturing. Or I can move within the sectors, say from subsistence farming to high-valued crops. You know, many years, in the early 1920s, Ghanaians began to grow cocoa. And very soon, people were moving all over the cocoa lands and growing cocoa for export. It enriched them, and many families became who they were because they went into cocoa very early, and they occupied all the land from the Achim lands, and now they're in the western region. They just migrate where the lands are open, and they grow cocoa. And last, we can also look at the national economy level, right? It involves creation of new subsectors, increased value addition in trade, and diversification. So we have to be doing more new things. Like we talked about the communication sector, right? They're doing new things. Things that didn't exist, they've created it. And at the level of the firm, it also involves the acquisition of new productive capacity and the ability to compete in larger and more distant markets on a growing scale. So we should be, if you want to transform, those are the things you should be doing. If you're doing that, we'll say you are transforming. So Vietnam, anybody watching Vietnam can say, yeah, something big is happening here, right? And they are beating a lot of countries in their own local things, right? And even China, they are making, somebody said, they make better saris than they make in India. Or they make better kente. No, I won't say that. Or they make good kente than they make in Ghana, right? So they choose a sector, and then they study it, and then they test it out, and eventually they get better and better and better. By the time you realize it, they have made some people redundant in Bonyure or Adangomasi or Kwetoi. So it all depends on the people learning how to do something, breaking out into the steps or the processes, and learning to improve those parts where they are weak. So let me also mention how our own asset, African Center for Economic Transformation. It is a think tank that is based in Ghana, international think tank, and they've been sending the message out for transformation for the last 25 years. I think they came here at the time when President Kufuor was in power, and they got some land near the roundabout, the rich circle, and eventually they moved to Ablimpi or thereabouts, right? So they define economic transformation as economic growth with depth. And the depth means diversification. Diversify your products and exports. You must become more competitive in what you do. Let me check this so that I don't have to be turning my eyes or my ears all the time. You must have productivity increases, which was mentioned in the first definition, and you must engage in continuous technological upgrades. You must be doing more and more new things. And then they added a last one, the H, which is the human well-being. After we do all of these things to benefit people, not just because we want to make more things or to be famous in trade, but somehow it should improve livelihoods by providing more productive jobs and higher incomes. So if you go to Hyundai manufacturing, you find that they are using more and more robots to do things, right? The Apple CEO, he went to Asia and he was amazed by the level of robots they were using in their manufacturing. So when the thing gets boring or repetitive, they put robots there, because robots won't complain. They won't go out for meals. They won't say they want to go to the bathroom or anything like that. they won't go on strike. So they're using a lot of them, right? So it also means that those of us who are humans have to have skills that should not be replaceable by the robots. Because if you are only for one time, I went to a park in the US, and they have a way of shaving all the trees to have the same height, same side, and so on. And they bring a machine, and the machine just does it for them, right? Before, a man would stand, a man would stand, and they would use some scissors to cut. No more. Right? It just feels it when it cuts, right? So let me now go to the third definition. And if you've been following the literature, some will talk of industrial policy. The same thing that we're talking about. So when they say industrial policy, then they are very specific. They will say a set of interventions made by government to promote the development of specific industries in a country. Specific industries. The goal is to improve competitiveness of these industries in the global market, increase exports, and stimulate economic growth. In the literature, some question the effectiveness of industrial policy, saying that it's an inefficient process that can waste government resources in an unpredictable race to determine which products or industries will survive and which companies within the industries will survive. So you are gambling. And when you gamble, sometimes you lose, and sometimes you win, right? And the same thing happens in research, R&D. We have different lines of research, and some research lead to nowhere, and some yield something. But when you combine all of it, we say we're making progress. So the fact that some led to a bad outcome doesn't mean that the thing was not a good thing. Because it's a gamble. And in a gamble, you get good outcomes and bad outcomes. Of course, you want more of the good outcomes or to happen, or you want one small good outcome, small probability event, to yield to a big outcome, then it overwhelms all the losses, right? In the late when I was in the US, there was a time when people were talking about small probability events with very high impact. Small probability events. So it's very, very small. But when it happens, it changes everything. And the question is how to model those kinds of stuff. Then some argue that industrial policy or economic transformation is what all the latecomers have used to catch up with economically advanced countries. And they point to Asian countries as the latest evidence of its necessity and effectiveness. In fact, some say that the British, when they were on top, they prevented people from bringing sending machineries abroad. And if you're a British citizen and you went to work for a German firm and they caught you, they will jail you because you're not sent technology abroad, right? Even today, there are programs in place to prevent the export of certain technologies. And so countries like China and other people, they try to find a way to get around it and get access to technology. Or if they see one, they will break it up and figure out and reverse engineer it so they can also do that, right? So when they are fighting, they are throwing a lot of drones. As soon as they catch your drone, they break it apart and see if they see what is in there. They can do the same thing, right? So it's a process that the true believers have said all the countries have used that. That's why they call it infant industry policies. And so we should not discount the benefits. The Asian countries have been the latest example of the necessity and the effectiveness of economic transformation or industrial policy. Let me sum up for you the three pillars that the Asians have used in their transformation agenda. First, they have a policy on agriculture, and they support smallholder farmers with land. They supported smallholder farmers with land access, quality seeds, fertilizer, extension services, and marketing. And then in manufacturing, they support the manufacturers with necessary incentives and subsidies to gain manufacturing capacity, to support, but they give the support is contingent on export performance and competitiveness in the global market. And then third, finance, they direct the banks, financial institutions, to lend to the targeted sectors as a national development requirement. So they say you must take a small profit now to make sure that the small companies will grow, and when they grow, then you can take a big profit. Right? That's the logic. So it's kind of a dynamic system that you invest before you reap. You don't eat the small fish, wait for them to grow. Then a small piece of it will be a big thing. So let me take a little detour and say a few things about some general ideas before I go on to talk about Asia in detail. So economic transformation is a long-distance race. You have to be prepared, and you have to engage in it. In Anna Karenina, Leo Tolstoy wrote, "Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own ways. Happy families are all alike. Unhappy families are unhappy in their own ways." So he says, for a family to be happy, you have to meet a certain special set of conditions. Maybe you like each other, maybe you support each other, and so on, right? You have mutual affection, you have financial security, you cooperate, you communicate, you have good health, and so on. But then, there are many different reasons why a family can be unhappy. And each unhappy family can pick one of those bad reasons, and that would be their reason for being unhappy. So maybe one of the One of them, they will falter on one or more of the critical factors that affect happiness. It is the same way, if you want to build an economically successful country, they are all alike. They do similar things. And unsuccessful countries are unsuccessful in their own ways. Perhaps one is corrupt. Perhaps one has no visionary leaders. Or one is a predatory state. Or one is anti-business. Or they're not practical or innovative. Everyone has a different reason for not making the complete set. Also, it is difficult to fake it. You can't pretend, right? Because you have to do the necessary things day in and day out, week after week, month after month, and year after year. In Ghana, at some point, one year we had the title of being the fastest growing economy in the world. Only for 1 year, then we fell. We want to be the fastest growing for year over year over year over year. If you can do that, then your numbers will show the transformation. And recently, we have been declared to have the best forex performing rate in the world, right? Again, it's only happened this year, right? We have to keep it and keep performing until it is undisputed that we are the leaders. So it's difficult to fake it. Second thing is that, and my son works at Google, and when they want to be promoted, before they move you to the next level, you have to show that you are doing the things that you would do as a supervisor at that level before they promote you there, right? So you get promoted to a higher rank after you've been performing those activities at the level for some time. So you have to kind of engineer yourself so that you are doing what your next level people are doing. And then you apply for promotion, then they'll give it to you. If you're not doing that, they don't give it to you. The logic is very simple. How can you supervise people if you've never done the thing that the supervisors are doing? Right? So it's very simple logic. So we cannot become an upper middle income country if we are not doing some of the things that upper middle income countries are doing. We'll remain a lower middle income country if most of our activities and outputs are similar to those of other middle income countries. Ghana has to break out from the pack of lower middle income countries and accelerate to overtake some of the upper middle income countries. So now I can go back to how Asia works. I can talk about it. There's a very nice book by Joe Studwell in which he describes the experiences of some 10 Asian countries. He called them Northeast Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries. And it's called the How Asia Works. And the subtitle is Success and Failure in the World's Most Dynamic Region. He provides compelling evidence that Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China followed a common developmental template and prospered, while other Asian countries got stuck at the middle income level because they did not know how to exit from the policy they had implemented. Many years ago, you heard about Mahathir Mohamad. He was doing everything. He even made Malaysia make a vehicle called Proton. And then never heard about Proton anymore, right? I remember when I was at the business school and I was getting ready to leave, one of my friends said, go and buy a Ssanyon car. He told me that Ssanyon was like a Mercedes-Benz with a different name. I didn't, but Ssanyon is no longer around, right? So the world is very dynamic. And so if you don't do certain things, you will just be dropped by the wayside. So the template has 3 building blocks, as I mentioned: agriculture, manufacturing, and finance. Agriculture offers immediate opportunity to increase economic output from a rural economy. Agriculture policy should make land readily available to smallholder farmers. The farmers should be encouraged and supported with quality seeds, fertilizer, simple technologies, extension and marketing to engage in labor-intensive agriculture to increase output and yield per hectare. This will raise farmers' incomes and provide raw materials for local manufacturing and increase demand for manufactured products. And so therefore, the rural people can then buy the manufactured goods that are being made in the urban centers. And then the country will become self-sufficient in food production and reduce food imports and save and conserve foreign exchange for the other things, for the capital goods and the other things, right? Now, this same advice was given by St. Lucian British economist called Sir Arthur Lewis. Gave it to President Kwame Nkrumah in the early post-independent years for the first 5-year development plan. Along the way, it was abandoned. And Arthur Lewis he left to go back to Manchester at that time. And later on, he went to Princeton University and went on to win the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics in 1979. He was the first and only black person to win that prize. So he was a high flyer who understood what the Asians were doing long before they began to do that, because he understood development very well. Studwell provides evidence that labor-intensive agriculture on smallholder farms outperformed plantations and large-scale farms and energized the rural communities. For example, in Ghana itself, we know that most of our plantations, like cocoa and other things, are smallholder farms. We never had the big plantation. Yet, Ghana was at one point the biggest exporter of cocoa. So it's not about farm size, it's about how you use people intensively to get the outputs. And you must always work with what you have. Don't imagine that things you don't have is what you need to do the things you want to do. For example, he says that rice and wheat yields in China and Northeast Asia were among the highest in the world. And they were more than 50% higher than what was achieved on large-scale US farms. In other words, large-scale farming is not advantageous in a rural community with abundant labor. Large-scale farming with expensive machines become viable when labor is scarce and expensive. And even where you need those equipment, the smallholder farmers, they can use expensive equipment such as a tractor. It can be leased, it can be shared among them, and they can use it in a cooperative arrangement. Whereas if one of them had it, it would be idle most of the time. And so the benefits would not be intensively utilized. Manufacturing is number 2. It provides an effective channel to bring relatively unskilled workforce in a low-income country into high-value production. Unskilled labor or workers can be trained to perform basic operations on a machine, and manufactured output can easily be scaled up or replicated with more machines and workers as the demand for the product grows. He points out that low-income countries typically have limited capacity in manufacturing, and that government support is needed to enable the local manufacturers to learn, grow, and eventually compete against established foreign manufacturers. He says that earlier industrializing nations like Britain and the United States had imposed protective tariffs. They've taxed the export of raw materials and banned certain imports in order to protect their nascent or infant industries. Studwell knows that manufacturing techniques cannot be learned by reading about them, or from textbooks, or hearing lectures, or participating in study tours. If I take you to a factory and you walk around, you won't see anything. You have the eyes, but you won't understand what is going on. But if an expert is in there, they will see every detail that is going on there. They can then even steal the idea and go and use it. But you will walk through, you won't see anything. Right? So manufacturing capability is developed through learning by doing. And Kenneth Arrow, one of the Nobel economists, wrote one of the most important papers on learning by doing and showed how it was one of the effective ways of expanding the technological frontier. It takes a lot of trials, experimentation, and adjustment, and innovation to manufacture efficiently and to satisfy consumer demand and quality preferences. Established foreign firms will outcompete inexperienced local manufacturers if the government does not provide necessary support and subsidies. Then he cautions that support for local manufacturers should not be open-ended or indefinite. Otherwise, the companies will become inefficient and direct their resources into rent-seeking and free rider activity and the rent-seeking and subsidy maintenance activities. An antidote against complacency and free riding is to engender competition in the local market and liquidate non-performing manufacturers. That's those who are receiving your support. The manufacturers receiving government support should also be required to export and become competitive in international markets. He says that government insistence on export performance and commitment to subsidy removal differentiated the successful countries from those that stagnated. Let me note that it takes tough leadership to remove subsidies once they've been normalized. Always when you take things away from people, they complain. So you have to be very, very strong and firm and put the rules up forward. That is what you are going to do. So it must be accepted as a condition of doing business. Participation in the export market serves two purposes. First, local manufacturers are forced to improve their product offerings when they deal with more demanding or sophisticated consumers. Secondly, when you compete against leading manufacturers in export markets, they force you to adopt best practices, and you have to increasingly upgrade your technology and business infrastructure to international standards. Finance is the third building block. Studwell mentions that the banks and other financial institutions should be directed or compelled to lend to the targeted sectors. Left on their own, banks would prefer to lend to large plantations than to lend to smallholder farmers. And left on their own, they'll prefer to lend to salaried workers, traders, and real estate developers than lend to manufacturers who are still learning to do what they are doing. In successful Asian countries, finance policy was aligned with national development goals, and they targeted their limited financial resources to support smallholder agriculture and manufacturing. The central banks also employed various lending criteria to incentivize the banks to give more loans to the exporters. And they set up specialized development banking institutions to ensure that funds were abundant and cheap for targeted sectors. On land, there were major reforms in China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan after the Second World War. Now the slogan, land to tillers, they divided agricultural land among the farming population, they abolished tenant farming and landlordism, and they gave them the things that we have there on the top there to ensure that they could produce for local market and for export. On manufacturing, the architect of South Korean industrialization was General Park Chung-hee. He came to power through a coup in 1961. He was familiar with Japanese industrialization, and he closely followed efforts to establish modern large-scale industries in West Germany, Turkey, Egypt, and other countries. His basic thesis was that the Korean state would do the planning and guide the private sector to make the required investment. First, they established a textile cartel and provided cheap loans, tax exemptions, and duty exemptions on raw materials to position Korea as a leading exporter of textiles. The large foreign exchange earnings they got from the textile sector funded the importation of equipment for industrialization. They set up what they call Economic Planning Board along the lines of MITI, M-I-T-I, in Japan, as the Ministry of International Trade and Industries. If you study industrial policy, you hear about MITI a lot. And there's a very nice book by Chalmers talking about the MITI and the rise of Japan. And so they decided they were going to heavy and chemical industries program. Land, cheap credit, and generous tax incentive were offered to entrepreneurs who could build export-oriented plants in petrochemicals, steel, shipbuilding, electronics, and machine building. The World Bank was skeptical and would not finance Korea's program to set up export-oriented heavy industry. Eventually, Korea obtained a reparations payment and a loan from Japan to set up an integrated steel plant. They also built a major highway joining their top cities. The plant called Pohan in Iron and Steel Company became one of the world's most efficient steel producers. And it's a very beautiful story about how they got into car manufacturing. What they did was that they pushed all their top business people into a race to develop a Korean car. Hyundai at that time had never manufactured a vehicle. It was into construction. And they later started to manufacture cement when they said it should go into exports. And then they got into assembling cars in a joint venture with the Ford Motor Company under the auspices of the Economic Planning Board. Hyundai eventually manufactured into an autonomous world-class automobile, exporting vehicles to every corner of the world. And now we have major Korean brands such as Kia, Hyundai, LG, Samsung, POSCO, and other major industries in chemicals and materials. They have emerged out of the industrialization drive. Korea is now a modern manufacturing powerhouse and a leader, an exporter of knowledge and technology incentive products. When Koreans tell their story of economic transformation, they highlight three main factors. First, they had visionary leadership, which was supported by a meritocratic bureaucracy that could execute industrialization agenda of the government. They took bold economic measures that were not approved or supported by international organizations and donors, especially on the heavy industries and chemicals program. But they realized that as a small country with limited demand in the country, if they don't have efficient size industries, they have to export. If you're old enough, there's a time when they said Ghana was too small to do many things. They wouldn't have economies of scale. Right now we are 30 million. I'm sure we hear the same thing, that we are too small, right? But if you are too small, the answer is the global market is so large. So if you can go there, you will address all the scale issues. So the takeaway message for us is that economic transformation requires strong and clear vision from the leadership, well-articulated transformation plans, a competent bureaucracy, and financial resources necessary to execute the plan. Second, they highlight their land reform issue. Now, I'll skip that one for a minute because I think I want to get to something that we can learn a lot from. Because I think virtually our constraints are not land. It's more than that. Even though others may think that it's an interesting constraint too. And maybe we need to dig deeply into that. But the government used what they call public works programs to change the mindset and values, stressing that nothing could be free and the people had to work hard to make a living to improve their lives. They required people to participate in public works programs to receive food aid donated by the US government. So when they got the food aid, they didn't just dish it out. They said, come and work. If you work, we'll give it to you as your payment. So more than 20 million Koreans participated in land reclamation and reforestation programs to get the food aid. And in the process, they became empowered, self-reliant, and hardworking. Takeaway message for us is that government grants should be channeled through self-help and community projects to empower the people and not given as handouts that create dependency and apathy. They also talk about the education, and I think I will not go into that, but they are one of the highest educated people. And when they started, more than 80% of the population was illiterate, of the adult population was illiterate. Then they first decided to make primary education compulsory, and then they even gave adult education programs for people who are illiterate to go to spend 200 hours over 70 days to get education. As a result, the illiteracy rate among the adults fell from 83% to 22%. So now let's go back to our slides. So now, the takeaway message, I think, let me give that before I continue with the Ghana's agenda. Takeaway message is that we should give the highest priority to educating our youth and assist them to acquire essential technical knowledge and national development orientation to enable them to contribute to Ghana's economic transformation and cultural renaissance. So here I have what is a 24-hour economy program that the current government is undertaking. It's the successor to the Ghana Beyond Aid, or what is commonly called One District, One Factory, right? So let's look at that. It came out initially that they wanted to support certain businesses to operate 24 hours a day in 3 8-hour cycles. And in the process, increase productivity, competitiveness, and create well-paying jobs. Now, obviously, not every business can do 24 hours, right? And also, even if you are giving policy for 24 hours of work, I would exclude jobs which normally do 24 hours, like the security services, right? Because they are there. So if you do an incentive, it should go to the people who would not otherwise have done it, not the people who are already doing the stuff, right? In the ports also, like when you go to Labadi and you look at the ocean, there's a time that you will see a whole lot of ships waiting to unload, right? And it's quite a scene. So they arrived in the ports are closed, and they have to wait for maybe a day before they can go and unload and get off. So maybe in those areas, that policy will be very, very beneficial. But I hear that they want to identify some 5,000 firms or institutions which implement a 24-hour policy. Whenever you do that, there must be demand. Because if I produce and nobody is buying, I'm going to stop producing. We also have a lot of idle capacity in many of the enterprises. So if they are running at 1/3 the capacity, you ask them to go 300%, that is 3 times their 100% capacity. Obviously, they are not doing that because they don't have the demand. So let's continue. So it has 3 pillars. The production transformation to increase the processing of local inputs. And they want to improve supply chains to connect producers to markets. And finally, there's a human capital development component, which is to provide training and skills for the workforce. It also has 8 sub-programs, very nice names. And I went to a talk, and somebody gave something similar to this. And I wanted to actually get a copy of the notes, but I got a feeling that it was very proprietary. I didn't want to share it. And I think that is what has appeared here. They call it Grow 24, Make 24, Build 24, Connect 24, Fund 24, Show 24, Apprise 24, and then Go 24. Very nice, catchy term. When you imagine it, it's very, very intuitive, and it points to a way that one could organize an autonomous society. Right. I won't get into details because we'll look at other things down the road. But it tells you that they have these ideas of an integrated system of manufacturing, agriculture, infrastructure, and so on. Then they have some priority projects. One is Volta Economic Corridor. Then they have a Legon Pharmaceutical Park, Kumasi Machinery and Technology Park, Ghana Mall, which is an online trading for made in Ghana goods, Akosombo Juapong Garments and Textile Park, TVET, Digital Centers of Excellence, Eden Volta, a lot of farmlands in the Volta Basin, and finally, I don't know how they pronounce this word, Ableduo, new agroecological parks. Very, very interesting ideas. Because we'll get into details down the road. And then there's a funding program. They say it's going to cost about $40 billion, and the government will give about 300 to 400 million as seed capital from GOG. Then they expect private capital to bring about 2 billion, and then others will come from levies, excise duties on imports. Right? Then there are incentives such as tax rebates, waiver of import duties, rebates on exports, concessionary loans, tax credits, export performance bonus, etc., etc. So, it's a program. I think it's a work in progress because there's a lot to be done to operationalize it. But let me make some observations on this and the other programs because they are all in the same vein. First of all, there's some fixation on the past. So every program we have has textiles, revived textiles, develop an integrated aluminum industry, revive the old industries, the rubber plantation, the Kumasi jute factory, the shoe factory, the Bologatanga meat factory, the Pualugu. We keep hearing about that and that and that, right? Then the sugar one recently and so on, right? So we keep repeating the past or going into the past without addressing the technical and market conditions in the new environment. Also, we have outsourced the thinking to the World Bank and IMF. So the allowable discourse is for the government to provide infrastructure or an enabling environment, right? And we do that when we don't have the factories that can enjoy the enabling environment. So at the end of the day, we end up doing procurement, that is buying steel, cement, design services, and so on. And we construct, and then we regulate. But the factories will be empty and they're not operating. So now I say there's a critical need for the government of Ghana to invest or partner with the private sector to establish large-scale businesses that aggregate raw materials or process raw materials into intermediate goods for the local private market. You notice that when I started, I talked about the glut in the maize, the glut in the rice, and all of that. All that's occurring because we have not done what we've done for cocoa, which is have a system of aggregating it, quality control, storage, and all of that. And the people are just taking small amounts, taking them to some warehouse, and it stays there. And lots of it has what they call aflatoxins. They've not been dried properly, and they are moldy, and so on. And after 1 year, they say, go buy it because we have an overstock. Now, if the government of Ghana bought it, I'll assure you that in some 6 months' time, the thing will need lots and lots of fumigation, and some will be like unedible. Because we haven't developed what we call the commercialization angle that allows cocoa to come from small farms and end up in big warehouses in Tema and shipped to Amsterdam and other countries. Right? So let me now show you what I call the textiles disaggregated. Textile exports, global textile exports. You see, if you want to revive textiles in Ghana, you have to think de novo. You have to think from scratch and ask yourself, if I was doing textiles today, which of these major sectors would I go in? Textiles is an 800 billion industry, the trade. And non-knit women's suits is 67 billion. Knit sweaters, 63.2 billion. Knit t-shirts, 47.5 billion. And so on. Maybe Ghana, what we are doing is in that tiny end, that little box that is not labeled. Maybe that's where we are from the 1960s. And if that's where you are, you should redirect the resources to go into a high-value activity. Right? Don't say that because I have this factory and it is doing this and that, it should continue to do that. When the world has moved on to bigger things. Now Vietnam, plenty of that. They're doing a lot of that. Bangladesh, and many others. So we have to decide where our textile industry should go, which sector they should plug into, and how we can capitalize in being in a bigger sector. When you're in a bigger sector, you are much more able to make a bigger piece of the pie. For example, our companies are very good in making our African textiles. To have been very good if they expanded and they were selling the textiles all over Africa. We would have like a global brand that people in South Africa, Kenya, because they're all wearing African print. But we restrict it to the local market, and then the only time they get an order is Christmas time, or it's a funeral, or there is something that, and please don't say I'm criticizing them, right? I'm just sharing ideas with you. Okay. So look at that picture and decide where you have the capacity to go in and where you want to position yourself in this big distance. Integrated aluminum. You hear that a lot too. Smelting is very energy intensive. The Volta Dam was funded because Kaiser Aluminum agreed to build a smelter at Tema and give an assured market for the electricity generated from the giant turbines in the dam. There are now jurisdictions with abundant and cheap electricity to smelt aluminum more economically than Ghana, and a doomsday country cannot be smelting aluminum. So if you want to do aluminum, then you have to do your power very well. Otherwise, you'll be so expensive, you can't even compete. I also say that very often, the programs tend to be fanciful. For example, one district, one factory. I can bash them because they're not in power anymore, right? Okay? When the DCEs and the committee members were polled about the local resource and manufacturing potential, they gave diametrically opposite assessments. Many districts said they had cassava in abundance, and they all thought they should make gari making factories. So every village wants to make gari making factories. Manufacturing, as we stated earlier, involves learning by doing. And it's not wise to run 260 different manufacturing experiments across the district assemblies. Even doing one is so hard. Then you say, let's replicate this at the same time in 260 different areas. You have to select one or two. You work out all the kinks, the challenges on raw material suppliers. You learn to run and repair the machines. You master the production technologies, and you succeed in selling the product on rural, self-employed workers. If you come to work at 8, you might not show up. Or he works for 1 week. Say, no, I have to go to my farm. And so on, right? Or this is too hard. I can't do it. So you need to have a disciplined strategy of how you integrate the rural workers into your manufacturing operations. Now, the 8 priority areas, I talked about that. Let me move back and see where If you look at it, there are a lot of parks. Kumasi Park, Legon Park, Akosombo Park. TVET is also a park. It's a center. They are also like a park. And agro-industrial park, right? So there's a lot of parks. It's a lot of parks. Oh, sorry. Go like this. Now, if they are successful, if these projects are implemented, it will mean a lot of construction of massive infrastructure. But the risk is whether the private sector will move in to occupy those parks. It has taken us a very long time to build free zone processing enclaves in the country. For many reasons, including the land cost. If you want a free zone plot, you say pay $1 million. Right? So not many manufacturing companies, apart from the multinationals, will have the capacity to do that. So they are just there as multinational enterprises. And everybody else finds a way to set up somewhere else. Also, even the free zones, there are no complementary suppliers around. So everybody is importing from far away and then exporting. If you look at other areas, like when, say, Hyundai in the US or Toyota in the US, you find that they bring their suppliers to be around. So they can do a just-in-time system. They will bring the raw materials or the part as and when needed, and they put it together. So they don't have a long warehouse full of spare parts before they can produce. In Ghana, you have to have that, because you can only import maybe 2 container load of sugar or whatever you are using. And that sugar will maybe last you a year or whatever, and they put another one. So if we don't get the suppliers nearby, the benefits of the parks are not going to be that large. Now, I ask myself whether the constraints we have are industrial park, whether it's really a major constraint. I believe that most problems can be handled judiciously through zoning and the provision of utilities to different factory locations. We should be mindful that it is not true that if you build industrial parks or you create farming land banks, the demand will follow. So you can build it and it will be empty. Right? You can have the farms and nobody will cultivate it. Right? Now let me talk a little about the World Bank and the IMF. For a long time, Ghana has outsourced the thinking. How are we doing? Am I okay? Has outsourced the thinking to the World Bank and the IMF. It appears that Ghanaian officials and technocrats have to be gold-plated by the World Bank or the IMF, and they must reference the two institutions in all economic matters to be heard. It's as if they are the resident governors and all-knowing experts. And there's a missing. Let me move back here. Yeah, there's a missing piece, which is that the GOG has to, if we look at all the economic transformation agendas, you find that curiously, they do not include establishment of productive factories by the Ghana government. And it's because it is difficult to justify it within the World Bank IMF narrative. Secondly, we've been traumatized by the failure of public enterprises that were set up in the early post-independence period. But in Asia, it is fully understood that certain industries that are privately owned in Europe and America is made possible because they have large pool of funds and managerial experience embedded in the private sector. So, the governments have no trouble, as in Asia, they have no trouble setting up large-scale industries. So it is essential to use public funds to build scale-intensive industries that are needed. The focus of such government enterprises should be to commercialize, aggregate local raw materials, and intermediate goods for local private sector. These public enterprises are run effectively. Don't throw the idea away because you failed the last time. It's a good idea, and it's needed in certain sectors. So now we can look at the opportunities and the pathways. I mentioned 3 things here. That it is the economic transformation is a strategic activity, and it should be championed and directed by the political leadership who are pursuing a vision to change the fortunes and the economic standing of the nation. They should also focus on a handful of industries or products. The examples we gave, they didn't say they were going to do everything. They pick selected industries, and then they do that. When they succeed, they expand it. And I also say that it requires, they should lead the process, and they should invite the private sector to participate and offer them the necessary incentives. Some of the leaders, when they were doing this, and they will put the economic planning unit next to them. You can think of President Nkrumah. He was always at the 5-year development plan meeting because he wanted to make sure they were doing what he wants to understand and make sure it's happening. So you cannot leave it to technocrats and say, you go ahead and do it. And it also requires, it also requires high-level technical inputs from technocrats. But it is not a technocratic exercise, right? It's a political process driven by political vision and leadership. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how people go about selecting what to do, right? I'm going to use, let me see what I have here. Okay, let me go back. I'm going to use a few illustrative tools to illustrate where the opportunities are and talk about a few analytic methods for doing that. These include revealed comparative advantage, production complexity, proximity, value chain analysis, trade deficits, and benchmarking. Let me give an example. Suppose I went to the farm, I walk into a farm. In that area, people are growing cocoyam, some are growing palm, and so on, right? And any of those people can do one product or the other because they use the same basic technologies, right? It's like that in industry and also among products. Some things have proximity. And it is as if you are in a forest. Let's say you pretend that you are a monkey, right? You're in the forest. You're in a tree, and you see different trees with different fruits on it. Those nearby trees, you can jump to it. That's the technology or the product. To trees that are closer and closer to you so that you can do those. Then as you get closer and closer, you can move to other trees. And eventually you form clusters, or the aluminum cluster, or other clusters. That's how these things happen. So let me look at a value chain analysis for cocoa. You probably heard many years ago that West Africa produces more than 60% of the world's global cocoa and gets very little money in the chain. So what I've done here is chocolate. And it shows you the global size of those industries. And it shows you the share of each of them in the global size. So for example, cocoa beans constitute 16.2% product, takes about 60% of the value. Then we look at what Ghana is producing. And of course, we could do the same for Cote d'Ivoire and for other countries, right? I'm looking at Ghana. And the year 2023, you find that Ghana exported almost about 1 billion in cocoa beans. Then they did quite well in the paste and butter. The shells, you get them when you either ground and polish the bean, or you can do it before after you roast, right? It's not very big, but Nigeria is quite big in the shells. I don't know how they do it, right? And so you can see that in the whole sector, it's 36 billion. Because a lot of it is taking place in the advanced countries. But nothing says that you cannot do that in the sub-region, right? Because it means you have to understand the product, the market, understand the taste of the consumers, and how to keep it from melting in the sun. Sometimes I wonder how the people selling, what do you call our bar? The red one, what do you call it? Golden tree, right? How they manage to keep it from melting in the hot sun, right? If you buy Cadbury's, it will melt in no time, but a golden tree can hold this. So it means that they have a formula that is appropriate to the environment. Of course, it's hard, but it involves design and manufacturing to make it a desirable product in other countries, right? So we look at the global share. I also have here what they call the product complexity of the different elements in the chain. Out of 1044 products, cocoa beans is the least complex. Making cocoa beans is 1044 out of 1044. And then the chocolate is 431 out of 1044. And then it goes like that. So to go down the chain, you have to understand the product complexity. You have to get good at doing certain things and so on, right? Marketing, technology, and all of that, right? I remember in the early 20s, President KOFI opened a cocoa grinding factory at CPC, and members were invited to go there, and the factory was so automated. There was just one person standing beside a huge machine, maybe as high as this place, and the whole thing was just throwing out the liquor and the butter and the powder and so on, right? Eventually, that factory, quote, became inactive. They owed the cocoa board a lot of cocoa, and eventually it became like a sub-contractor to the big multinationals that are also at the free zones. So they were then using it to grind for Barry Callebaut and the other companies. Right? So there's opportunity. Then I did this example because a professor at the University of Ghana said that Ghana exports raw gold. And I said, let me check what it is. It turns out that in the gold chain, Ghana does about equal in the semi-manufactured and the raw gold. And actually, the raw gold is more than the semi-manufactured. So we are not doing a very bad thing in that area. I'll skip. I also looked at the trade deficits. Oops, time is flying. Yeah. And I look at the deficits we have in the various products. There are like 16 products. And within each of them, there's a chain that tells you the different things that are made under each of those. Also look at the trade complexity, and you can use some of that to identify products and things that Ghana has the capacity to perform. Sometimes gold is hidden under the stone and glass, textile is there, and so on, right? And we can look at vegetables, wood, and other things. I also looked at crude palm oil. Ghana talks about palm oil a lot, right? And when you think of palm oil, you think Ghana has a lot of it. But when you look at the global market, Malaysia is exporting 4.3 billion. Indonesia, 4.0 billion, and so on. Because Cote d'Ivoire, 126 million. Ghana does only 15 million. 15 million in a 12.6 billion industry. So we are not doing anything in oil palm. Then you go to palm oil, the oil, what Fritol does, right? They call it simply refined because it's not a very complicated process. Indonesia leads 20 billion. Whole is about 35 billion, the traded portion. Again, Ghana does about 15 million. So Ghana has no footprints in those areas. Cote d'Ivoire seems to be playing its cards very well. Everywhere it shows up in many of them. And then I also looked at something that we don't hear a lot about, and that is fresh dried cashew. Ghana is number 5 in the world in the production, in the trading of fresh dried cashew. Tanzania is there, Togo. It looks like West Africa is a big player. Look at Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, 1.3 billion, right? So the untold story is that Ghana is among the world's top exporters of fresh dried cashew. And buyers troop in from India and Vietnam to the Bono regions to source cashew for processing. West Africa as a whole, from Burkina Faso to Senegal to Togo, are major exporters, and there's room for the establishment of many cashew processing factories in Ghana. But our plans about the projects have no room for cashew. We seem to be going to the same old stories. So let me give some recommendations, and then I can get the chairperson to take over. To become an upper middle income country, Ghana's economic transformation strategy should enable local production and manufacture of all things critical to national survival and dignity. There are some things that every human being has to do or make. And if you're a nation, you have to do those things too. So that's number one, right? There are some things also that you lose your dignity if you let other people do it for you. So you have to stand on your feet and do certain things for yourself, right, young people? Okay. Then, we go to the next stage. The whole world runs on fabrication. What I'm standing on here is a fabricated product made from wood. This is a fabricated product made from plastic, and so on. If you buy a guitar, musical instrument, they are all made from materials, fabricated. So we have to design and fabricate increasingly sophisticated parts and products using metals, plastics, wood, paper, concrete, ceramics, and other materials. So fabrication is a prerequisite for doing many, many things. We have to have that. Even the lights we have here, or even this speaker, is fabricated inside some box. If you order something, to come inside a paper box or a wood box, whatever. So let's do to fabricate. We have to continuously upgrade technology, knowledge, and skills that are used in the economy. And we have to identify and select high-valued exportable products and services to produce and manufacture for the local and global market. And government should lead and direct a promotion transformation program, incentivizing the private sector to deliver its part. For agriculture, the government should support smallholder farmers to gain access to farmland, quality seeds, fertilizer, improved tools, extension services, and credit. It should organize commercialization for selected crops using the cocoa board model, aggregation, quality control, storage, transportation to markets and local processes. Because those are scale-intensive activities. If we ask every cocoa farmer to bring their cocoa to Accra, we wouldn't have an industry. For manufacturing and high-value services, government should support local manufacturers with cheap inputs, electricity, credit, and targeted infrastructure. Very often they say, oh, they are doing this thing here, so they should build their own roads. They have the mining model in mind. In the mining model, you go to a remote area where the mine is, and you build your dormitories, your schools, everything, because there's nothing in that area. You build your roads. That model doesn't apply when the company is in Tema or Accra, and the road just needs to be fixed by the local authority. Government should play a leading role in establishing large-scale businesses that aggregate raw material or process raw materials into intermediate goods for local manufacturers. Then we talk about business environment. A lot of business environment discussions take place. So I'm going to talk about that. Just talk about two things. Is that we should get away from checking World Bank Ease of Doing Business framework, checking the boxes, and address long-standing concerns and complaints of the local private sector. The quest for IGF, internally generated funds have had a very negative effect on the regulatory agencies and district assemblies. They more or less have turned into predators. And I use that word reservedly, right? Where they go to government or they go to parliament, they specify some fees they can charge. They'll double the fees or triple the fees. Parliamentarians approve. No discussion. And so you find that many of them are funding their IGF by charging higher and higher fees. In fact, recently the DVLA people started to impound vehicles. They impound vehicles because they say you didn't have this sticker or that sticker. Even though the vehicle might have a red light that shows that you are stopping. But they say, no, you must have a sticker, a red sticker on there. So they've all turned into predators looking for money to fund their IGF. If I want to get my water tested, and I'm not knocking our friends here, but the money they're going to charge, I probably will not go and test my water anymore. So then we are endangering public health because the people are not testing their water, they are not going for tests on their raw materials and so on, right? So we need to know that these public extension services are for the public good, and they should be cheap and affordable, and they shouldn't be the medium for funding IGFs. People complain that taxes and port charges are excessive, and they often violate fair taxation principles. And my favorite example is that Ghana imposed arbitrary levies on transactions. They call the KOFI levy, Get Fund levy, and other levies. Then they decided that they would charge VAT on the levies as well. You can't deduct the levies, but also have to pay VAT on the levies. And there was no debate, no public input, and of course, you don't get progress if you do things like that. So, brings me to the end of my lecture. I thank you, and I appreciate the Academy and our sponsors for
Shall we give him another round of applause? As I sat there listening to you, I was thinking, why don't we have ministers of finance like you? It's not about politics. Because this man has told us, he started with some broad issues, food insecurity, poverty. He was only reading the statistics. It's increasing instead of going down. Poverty in Ghana. Ghana's GDP stagnating. And I kept thinking, and all the things, you know, I used to work for the United Nations in Addis Ababa. So when you were talking about the definitions of economic transformation, we use the industrial policy a lot. You know, that basically when you look at African countries, we've abandoned, because there was a time when we were doing the industrial policies, and we've abandoned it. And it explains to a large extent what is not happening. So as I kept listening, I thought, do we want to fix our economies or not? And when I was introducing you, I was saying that we might be going away feeling optimistic or pessimistic. I'm not pessimistic because the lecture shows that we know what to do, or that some people know what to do. The problem is that when we have lectures like this, the policymakers are never here. The people who need to know are not here. the students were fidgeting a lot because this was heavy stuff. And they need it, but it's still heavy stuff. And it's important that the technocrats that you were talking about, that they should be here to listen to these issues that are being raised. We have been punching below our weight for many, many decades. We got to lower middle income status 20 years ago. And we were very excited. That was when, so all this currency business, when 1 cedi was equal to $1. 1 cedi. At some point, 1 cedi was higher than the dollar. We were excited. And where are we now? 20 years later, the zigzags. Sometimes we're here, sometimes we're not there. And the lecture also showed us our vulnerabilities because of those very factors. If you are mainly a raw material exporter, it means that when, like now, gold is doing very well. So, if you are a gold exporter, you are salivating. But it will not always be like that. So these are some of the things that constitute our vulnerabilities. The lecturer gave us different definitions of economic transformation, but I noted that, like a true scholar, he showed no preferences. He did not tell us which one he preferred. He told us the components of it, but he didn't tell us anything. He was almost agnostic, Yes, some people argue, some others do this, etc. But we don't know his position. But the Asian stories were very telling because you are very young. But if you look at the economic literature, they tell you about Ghana and South Korea in the early 60s. And we were almost at the same level. And then 60 years later, one has flown and one is still hovering near the ground. Malaysia came and borrowed palm oil from Ghana. They did not have palm oil. They took it from here. And now we saw the figures. We are importing a lot of palm oil into this country. Palm oil is not just used for the stews. It is used in industry. And we are importing a lot of palm oil because once again, stagnated. I felt hopeful when I heard about cashew because I lived in Tanzania in the mid-1970s. And before I went to Tanzania, I had not seen cashew in Ghana. So it was in Tanzania that I saw cashew. So it was interesting for me that now Ghana is above Tanzania when it comes to cashew production. But very recently, I think a week or two ago, I read about the problems of the cashew industry in Ghana here. So it comes back to the elements of success that our lecturer listed. The consistency, doing something continuously, you see. So we do something, and then it succeeds, and then we take our eyes away. And before we know it, it has collapsed. So I put down what the ingredients of success are. And it's like for you in school. If you are not going to succeed because you pray a lot or you do something like that. You have to be intentional. You have to plan. You have to put in effort. You have to work hard. You have to be consistent. You can't keep getting high marks this term and then next time you are at the bottom. If you want to succeed, you have to aim and maintain the standard. And this is what we are finding out from those who have succeeded, that they plan, they are intentional, they devote resources, It's not like, inshallah, maybe this will happen, this may not happen. They're very intentional. I used to be at the National Development Planning Commission. At some point, I was the vice chair. And I kept saying, I had been on the National Development Planning Commission in 2 different administrations. We never met with the president on either, apart from the day that we were inaugurated. So if you look at some of these countries, and Professor KOFI Nti was telling us, in the 60s, the president was very eagle-eyed about these development plans and the development commissions. Here it's like ticking the box, a checklist. You have this. But nobody, we kept asking, we had meetings that you need to have either the president or the vice president chair the commission so that everybody will see that this is serious business. And it was almost like a take this cap away from me, oh Lord, Never got that buy-in. So the commission exists. Often it does not even have resources to do anything. And yet we learned in the recommendations about leadership, about planning, the mix of the technical and the political will and interest that are required. So that is what I'm hopeful about. I know that it's not only Professor KOFI Nti or those of us listening, that there are so many people out there, even in our bureaucracies and in our political parties, who know about these things. And the question is, why do they not do it? Why do they not do it? He provides some of the answers for us. This fixation on the past, as if everything has stayed as it is. We will revive this, we will do that. What has changed in the meantime? Have the cows grown fatter or more numerous that you are now going to be able to ensure that if you set up a corned beef factory in Bolga or somewhere, there will be the inputs for it, etc., and that it may be cheaper than what you are importing. So we do have very serious work cut for us. I was thinking, they mentioned that last week that the presidents in Koko and Kitinkiti was going to be distributed soon. But clearly, we're going to need more than the Koko and Kitinkiti. There has to be complementary policies that will support anything that is done. So as you get this, the feed. What about the feed for the chickens? Because they will grow. If they are going to grow from Nkiti to Nkasi, they will need to eat something. And who is doing that? So how you get finance, how you direct inputs, all of those things together. You go to the market and you see these really tiny fish, and you're asking, who even let them grow? You are taking them from the river, How are we going to manage? So there really are a lot of issues that we need. But I think that I hope that the schools, some of the teachers will ask for the slides and go over some of the things that look a little complicated but are not so complicated. So we look at the value chains and we find how we are shortchanging ourselves, I went to Ecuador. Ecuador is in South America. And they produce some of the finest chocolates in the world. When you fly first class in Emirates, you are served chocolates from Ecuador. Lovely chocolate. Cocoa is indigenous to Ecuador. And they have really mastered it. In fact, the chocolates in Ecuador are nicer than Swiss chocolates, in my view. The quality is really great. So you don't have to be a rich country to be able to do that. But is this harnessing of competencies and skills and all of those things to be able to come into that bottom value chain, and not just, the big one. You carry a whole sack of cocoa and what you get. Somebody with a small box of chocolates, $300, they put it in their pocket. And your whole cocoa sack, how much have you gotten? And also you are exporting skills. So that was what I was also hopeful about, that we seem to think that our unemployment problem is unsurmountable. And yet within these value chains are all the prospects for jobs. So I can't end by not going over your population pyramid at the beginning when you were telling the median age around Africa. In Niger, the median age is 15, and in Ghana is 21. And then this past week, we've had elections around Africa. One in Cameroon, where the elected president is 92 years. In Côte d'Ivoire, where the elected president is 83 years, and in Tanzania, where there is now a debacle, they can't even count the results in some of the constituencies. There are protests about, because the opposition leader was thrown in jail, another was disqualified, and the madam who is going to win is somewhere in her 60s. But it just tells you that until we also bring, although here we may be quite similar to Asia, isn't it? They also have some gerontocrats, don't they? Prof, I'm asking you a question. I'm saying that in Asia, they also have some. They have some. But anyway, but also Japan, they have over 100,000 people over 100 years old. So it may make sense. But here we have these median ages of 15 and 21, and our leaders are in their 80s or 90s. So clearly we also need to youthify our politics and make sure that they are listening. But to end, I just want to say to you students that this is a lot of value. It may take time to digest, but to say that we should remain hopeful. There are many jobs here in Ghana. You don't need to go through the Mediterranean. We just need to insist that our leaders do and take us to economic transformation so that we can solve our problems and lead dignified lives here in Ghana. Thank you very much.
Right. Time is far spent. We know a few remarks and announcements, and then we'll be done. I can't not resist repeating the question is, why do we not all do it if we know what we have to do? A round of applause for our chair for summarizing a brilliant state-of-the-art, super-academic, super-technical lecture. We acknowledge the sponsors who have been gracious, magnanimous to sponsor this lecture. We wish to acknowledge Universal Hospitals Group Limited, Associated Consultants Limited, and Claims Limited. And a favorite part, I always say that we acknowledge very much the schools who consistently visit here, and today I think we have all not been disappointed at all. So we acknowledge the presence of Laboni SHS, right? Accra GAAS SHS, and Accra Academy. Personally, I would like to say also congratulations to you all for your resilience. Quite an academic lecture. So announcements, and then we are out of here. An upcoming event, 59 Founders Week Celebration Program. The Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences in November every year, that's the Founders Week program. And this year, the program is on the theme, Navigating Political Transitions, Issues and Lessons. This will be from Tuesday 11 to Friday 14th November 2025 in this same auditorium. We cordially invite you all for what promises to be a very interesting program with very distinguished speakers. And finally, I would like to say that there's among sponsors in the Academy has graciously provided us with refreshment. So fellows and dignitaries, you are kindly asked to be at the Fellows Lounge. And for our students, as always, going by the time, you have packed snacks that you take along with you back to your various schools. That brings us to the end of the program. And that's for yourselves. So I'll kindly ask that as the speaker leaves the podium respectfully, and let's be outstanding. Have a good night.